He was a king who couldn't chew his own food, a monarch whose enormous, lolling tongue made his speech an incomprehensible mumble, forcing him to drool uncontrollably. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. He remained illiterate his entire life. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because his subjects, his court, and even the priests who performed terrifying exorcisms on his frail body, could not believe that God or nature could produce such a broken creature. This was Charles II, King of Spain and the last of his line. He was not just a man, he was a genetic ruin, the final horrifying result of 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding. His story is not just a tragedy, it is a warning. It is the story of how the most powerful dynasty in Europe, the Habsburgs, in their insatiable quest for power, committed a slow, deliberate, biological suicide, culminating in one of the most unfortunate human beings ever to wear a crown. To understand how this happened, how a family so obsessed with its own bloodline ended up poisoning it, we must go back. Back to a time when a simple motto became a dynastic obsession. Belligerent alii, tu Felix Austria, nube, let others wage war you, happy Austria marry. The Habsburgs didn't conquer Europe with armies, they inherited it through wedding rings. Their strategy was simple, and for a time, brutally effective. They collected kingdoms the way a child collects stamps, all through carefully arranged unions. And at the heart of this strategy was a physical trait that would become both a symbol of their power and a harbinger of their doom, the jaw. We see it first, clear as day, in portraits of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor at the turn of the 16th century. Look at his face, that jutting lower jaw, the prominent chin, the slight underbite. It is there. This was mandibular prognathism, a genetic trait that ran in the family. In Maximilian, it was a quirk, a defining feature, perhaps even a sign of determined character. No one could have known it was a seed, a genetic marker, that when cultivated in the closed garden of the Habsburg family tree, would grow into a monstrous deformity. Maximilian's ambition was boundless. He dreamed of a universal monarchy, a Habsburg empire on which the sun would never set. And the key to this was marriage. His son, Philip the Handsome, was married to Joanna, the daughter of the mighty Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the very patrons of Christopher Columbus. This was the masterstroke, the union of the Austrian Habsburg lands with the vast, wealthy Spanish Empire. But this pivotal marriage was also a glimpse into the emotional and mental instability that would haunt the dynasty. Joanna was known to history as Juana Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her love for Philip was a consuming fire, a possessive, jealous obsession that spiraled into madness. When Philip died young, her grief was terrifying. She refused to be separated from his embalmed corpse, traveling with his coffin for years, occasionally opening the lid to gaze upon his decaying face. Was it true madness, or the desperate grief of a woman manipulated by the men in her life? Her father, her husband, her son, who all sought to sideline her and seize her power. Whatever the truth, the label stuck, and the spectre of insanity now clung to the Habsburg bloodline, alongside the jaw. The son of Philip, the Handsome, and Joanna, the Mad, was Charles V. He inherited it all. Spain, its American empire, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy. He was the most powerful man in the world, and in his portraits you see it again, more pronounced now. The jaw. He struggled to close his mouth completely, which gave him a perpetually stern, aloof expression. He suffered from debilitating gout, another curse of the family, likely exacerbated by a diet rich in red meat and alcohol. The only things he could consume with pleasure, as his misaligned teeth made chewing a chore. But Charles V, for all his power, saw his empire as too vast, too unwieldy for one man to rule. Upon his abdication, he did something that would seal the fate of his descendants. He split the House of Habsburg in two. To his brother Ferdinand went the Austrian lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. To his son, Philip II, went Spain, the Netherlands, and the sprawling overseas empire. From this moment on, the two branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs, would begin to look inward. To keep the power, the titles and the wealth within the family, they began to marry each other. Nieces married uncles, first cousins married first cousins. It was no longer just a strategy for expansion. It became a paranoid obsession with consolidating what they already had. A closed loop of power and a closed loop of genes. And it was in the Spanish branch that this obsession would curve into a death spiral. Let's follow the blood. Philip II of Spain, Charles' son, was the product of first cousins. A devout, almost fanatically religious man, he ruled his global empire from a small Spartan office in his palace, monastery, El Escorial. His first marriage was a political one, to Mary Tudor of England. It was childless. After her death, he needed an heir, and he looked to his own family. He married his niece, Anna of Austria. She was the daughter of his own sister. Think about that, he married his sister's child. The son born of this union was Philip III. By now the physical and mental toll was becoming more apparent. Philip III was a weak and indolent ruler, known for his pious lethargy. He lacked the drive and intelligence of his father and grandfather. The government was largely run by his favourite, the Duke of Lerma, and who did Philip III marry? His cousin, of course. Margaret of Austria. She was his first cousin once removed. Their son, born from this ever-shrinking gene pool, was Philip IV. Philip IV's reign is often seen as the beginning of Spain's visible decline. He was more interested in art, theatre, and his many mistresses than in the tedious business of governing. The great painter Velázquez was his court painter, and through his brutally honest portraits, we can watch the genetic decay in real time. Look at Philip IV. The jaw is now unmistakable. It is long, heavy, and thrust forward. His lower lip is thick and drooping, a feature that would become known as the Habsburg lip. He was melancholy, prone to bouts of severe depression. Yet, the dynastic imperative remained: produce a male heir. Philip V's first wife, Elizabeth of France, gave him a son, Balthazar Charles. For a time it seemed the line was secure. Velázquez's portraits of the young prince show a lively, intelligent boy, but he died of smallpox at 16, plunging the king and the kingdom into despair. Philip IV was now a widower and desperate. So where did he turn? He turned to the only place the Habsburgs ever looked, his own family. He married his niece, Mariana of Austria. She was 30 years his junior. She was the daughter of his own sister, Maria Anna of Spain. This union of an uncle and his niece, who were themselves the products of generations of inbreeding, would be the one that produced the final fatal result. It would produce Charles II. Before we witness the full horror of Charles's life, we need to understand what was happening on a biological level. For centuries no one knew. They blamed curses, divine disfavor, miasmas, and witchcraft. But the real culprit was hiding in plain sight, in their very DNA. Think of your genetic code as a vast library containing all the instruction manuals for building and running your body. You get one set of books from your mother and one from your father. Most of the time, if one book has a typo, a faulty gene, the other parent's book has the correct version, and the body can read that one instead. The faulty gene is called recessive. It is there, but it is silent. Inbreeding is like taking that library and replacing most of the books with photocopies of a small select group of family-owned texts, and you keep photocopying the photocopies. Every smudge, every misprint, every torn page gets duplicated, amplified, and passed down. Eventually, you reach a point where for a specific instruction manual, say, the one for building a jaw, both the copy from the mother and the copy from the father have the exact same typo. The body has no correct version to read. It has no choice but to follow the faulty instructions. This is called homozygosity, and it's a genetic nightmare. The Habsburgs were turning their DNA into a collection of these faulty instructions. The prominent jaw, the drooping lip, the large tongue, epilepsy, gout, depression, infertility. All of these were recessive traits that were usually masked in the general population. But within the Habsburgs' closed genetic loop, they became dominant. Scientists have quantified this. They use something called an inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how likely it is that an individual will inherit two identical genes from a common ancestor. For the child of two unrelated parents, the coefficient is 0. For the child of first cousins, it is 6.25%. Now, let's look at the Spanish Habsburgs. Philip III's inbreeding coefficient was over 20%. Philip IV's was also around 20%. And then we get to Charles II. His father was his mother's uncle. His grandmothers were sisters. His great-grandmother was also his grandmother. The family tree isn't a tree at all. It is a tangled, knotted wreath. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was a staggering 25.4%. To put that in perspective, the coefficient for a child born from a brother, sister or parent, child union is 25%. Genetically, Charles II was more inbred than the offspring of an incestuous relationship between siblings. He was, in a very real sense, his own great-uncle. His body and mind were the battlefield where all the genetic ghosts of his ancestors had come to wage their final, devastating war, and from the moment of his birth in 1661, it was clear this was a battle he could not win. The birth was greeted with cautious relief. He was male. He was alive. But the relief quickly turned to dread. The infant was weak, sickly, and bore the family curse to an extreme degree. The Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth did not meet. He could not chew. His food had to be mashed or pre-chewed for him his entire life. His tongue was so large, it was a constant obstruction, causing him to drool and making his speech a garbled mess of guttural sounds that only his closest attendants could decipher. He was plagued by fevers, skin rashes, and chronic, debilitating diarrhea. For 4 years, he was breastfed by a team of 14 wet nurses, their milk being seen as the only thing keeping his fragile body alive. He couldn't walk until age 8 and was carried everywhere. His intellectual development was severely stunted. Attempts to educate him were a complete failure. He remained functionally illiterate and innumerate. He was treated not as a king, but as a perpetual fragile infant. His mother, the Regent Mariana of Austria, infantilized him, keeping him swaddled in charms and religious relics, terrified that any exertion, physical or mental, might kill him. His reign was a vacuum. While the Spanish Empire crumbled under economic decay, military defeats, and political rot, its king spent his days playing with dwarfs, indulging in childish pranks, and wandering the halls of his palace like a ghost. Power was a game of tug, of war between his mother and his illegitimate half-brother, Don Juan Jost of Austria. The court was a nest of vipers, with factions scheming and plotting around a throne that was, for all intents and purposes, empty. But the people of Spain and the court itself could not see the genetic truth. They saw a king who was physically deformed, mentally feeble, and chronically ill. They saw a king who, despite 2 marriages, was clearly impotent and sterile, unable to produce the heir that the kingdom so desperately needed. This couldn't be natural. It had to be the work of the devil. It had to be witchcraft. Charles was not sick, he was bewitched. And so began one of the most bizarre and tragic chapters of his life, the exorcisms. Priests and inquisitors were summoned. They subjected the king to terrifying rituals. They interrogated demons they believed were lurking inside him. One famous exorcist from Germany, Fray Mauro Tenda, spent months with the king. He declared that Charles had been cursed with a potion made from human remains, a dead man's kidneys and intestines, fed to him in a cup of chocolate when he was 14. The spell, he claimed, had rendered him impotent and was slowly consuming his body. They performed elaborate rites, waving crucifixes and chanting incantations over the terrified king. They ordered him to swallow holy water and powdered relics. They forced him to wear consecrated pouches filled with herbs and bone fragments. These rituals did nothing to cure his genetic ailments, but they terrified Charles, deepening his anxiety and depression. He became convinced he was possessed. His piety turned into a morbid obsession with death and decay. In a particularly macabre episode, he demanded that the tombs of his ancestors in the royal crypt of El Escorial be opened. He went down into the cold, dark vault and stared, for hours, at the rotting corpses of his family. He gazed upon the body of his father, Philippe IV. He reportedly had the coffin of his first wife, Marie-Louise d'Aulx-Sultans, opened, and he wept over her decaying form. It was as if he was searching for answers among the dead, seeking communion with the very people whose blood had damned him. All of Europe watched this grotesque spectacle with a mixture of pity and predatory anticipation. The great question of the age was, who would inherit the Spanish Empire when the bewitched king finally died? Charles's sterility was not just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical crisis waiting to happen. His first marriage was to the beautiful and vivacious French princess, Marie-Louise d'Aulx-Sultans. The Spanish court was horrified by her modern French ways, and she was miserable in the stiff, suffocating environment. For 10 years, she was subjected to endless prayers, pilgrimages, and humiliating medical treatments in a desperate attempt to conceive. There were false alarms, hopeful rumors of a pregnancy, but they all came to nothing. She died young, possibly from a ruptured appendix, but rumors swirled that she had been poisoned by factions at court, who blamed her for the lack of an heir. His second wife was a German princess, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was ambitious and politically savvy, but her task was impossible. She too failed to conceive. To maintain her position, she faked pregnancies, padding her stomach and claiming morning sickness, only to stage a miscarriage months later. The deception and intrigue were constant. The two great powers of the age, France under the Sunday King, Louis Chiv, and the Austrian Habsburgs under Leopold I, circled Spain like vultures. Both Louis and Leopold had claims to the throne through their own Habsburg wives. Diplomats and spies swarmed Madrid, each trying to pressure the weak-willed Charles to name their candidate as his successor. The fate of millions hung on the pen stroke of a man who could barely write his own name. As the 17th century drew to a close, Charles's health collapsed completely. The boy who couldn't walk until he was 8 was now, in his late 30s, unable to stand at all. He suffered from seizures, which the court interpreted as demonic attacks. His body swelled with fluid. He was racked with fevers and perpetual indigestion. By the age of 38, he looked like a senile old man. His hair had turned white, his face was bloated and edematous, and his mind was almost completely gone. In the autumn of 1700, it was clear the end was near. On his deathbed, surrounded by priests and scheming courtiers, he was pressured into signing a will. He named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis Chiv of France, as his sole heir. In doing so, he hoped to keep the Spanish Empire intact, passing it to the only power strong enough to defend it. It was his final, and perhaps only significant political act. He died on the 1st of November 1700, 5 days short of his 39th birthday. The curse was lifted. The last Spanish Habsburg was dead, but the story does not end there. After his death, an autopsy was performed, and the report is one of the most horrifying documents in medical history. It is the final, irrefutable evidence of the genetic catastrophe. The physician wrote that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was found to be the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. His kidneys were diseased, and perhaps most disturbingly, he had a single testicle, which the report described as black as coal. And his head, they noted, was full of water. This was the physical legacy of the Habsburgs' obsession. A body so ravaged from within that it defied medical explanation at the time. It was the physical manifestation of 200 years of marrying too close to the blood. Charles's death did not bring peace. His will, leaving the empire to a French prince, shattered the balance of power in Europe. The Austrian Habsburgs, feeling betrayed, contested the claim. England and the Dutch Republic, fearing a superstate of France and Spain, sided with Austria. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession. A brutal, decade-long conflict that engulfed the continent, killing hundreds of thousands and redrawing the map of Europe. The Habsburgs' marriage strategy, designed to accumulate and preserve power, had ultimately plunged their world into a devastating war. The Spanish throne passed to the French Bourbons, and the House of Habsburg, in Spain, ceased to exist. Their magnificent world-spanning empire, built on wedding vows, was dismantled by a conflict born from a single empty cradle. The tale of the Habsburg Jaw is more than just a lurid piece of historical gossip. It is a profound and tragic lesson. It shows how pride and the pursuit of dynastic purity can lead to ruin. The very trait that marked their noble lineage, the prominent jaw, a symbol of their identity, became the emblem of their decay. It was a crown of bone, growing more twisted and painful with each generation, until it finally destroyed the king who wore it. The Habsburgs believed their blood was special, a sacred fluid that set them apart from common men. But in their desperate attempt to keep it pure, they violated a fundamental law of nature. And nature, in the end, always collects its debts. Charles II was the bill, the final terrible price for his family's pride. He was El Hechizado, the bewitched king. But the only curse that afflicted him was the one that flowed through his own veins, a legacy of power and poison, passed down from one generation to the next, until there was nothing left but a broken man on a crumbling throne.